Good afternoon. We have the distinct pleasure of getting to talk over you guys while you're still finishing your lunch, which isn't fair for anyone. But we will go ahead and do so. And I just wanted to say we're delighted that NATOA chose to come here to St. Paul this year. We are really glad to have everybody here, and we are most glad to see that the polar vortex isn't coming until you guys go home. So we're glad to have you here in St. Paul. And the timing of your visit is pretty fitting as our state efforts as far as a coordinated response to broadband access and use gaps is really starting to pay off. As many of you may be aware, our legislature and governors set aside $20 million during the last session to help incent construction into those most difficult and underserved parts of our state. And we are just opening the doors on that grant program this last week, and we hope to have those awards out by the end of the year. So timing on this event and a couple of other related events has been really fortunate for us. And as we get that ball rolling down the hill a little bit as far as the access piece is concerned, our next challenge from the state's perspective is really defining what is our most effective role in the topic that we're here to talk about today, which is the engaging on the broadband adoption and use piece of it. And so, which is why I very happily agreed to moderate this panel, because we're about to hear from experts who are engaged in broadband adoption work in three pretty distinctly different lenses, and I think each of them have some lessons and takeaways for those of us who are working at different aspects of this work. First, we will hear a high-level view from the American Libraries Association about some of the work that's being done in libraries throughout the country. And then we'll hear the perspective of a place-based private foundation that is engaged in building broadband use capacities, particularly focused in rural areas. And finally, we'll hear about a robust and vibrant urban-based senior-focused initiative that comes out of New York. Each panelist will give us a few minutes of introduction of their work, and then we'll get into questions. We have some prepared questions to kick things off, but we hope as you listen to them speak that you'll think of questions that will guide our conversation to where it's most meaningful for you all. And we will obviously reserve time for those questions at the end. And with that, I would just say first up is Larra Clark. She is the director of the program on American Libraries for the 21st century within the American Libraries Association.
Thanks, Danna, and thanks to NATOA for inviting us to come talk about this topic. This is my first time here, and already the programs from this morning have been really interesting. So thank you for having me and the American Library Association, and for making time for this topic here. So a little bit about the American Library Association. We're a membership and advocacy organization of librarians, individual members, not surprisingly, school libraries, public libraries, academic libraries, so we cut across the gamut, and also trustees and other people that support libraries. I work in the Office for Information Technology Policy, so we focus on the advocacy and public policy questions, particularly around our big picture goal around equitable access to online information. That's our reason for being and drives much of our work through our telecommunications portfolio, our kind of interest in gigabit networks for communities and libraries, and also copyright and fair use questions. So I'm going to mostly talk about libraries as opposed to the American Library Association, but we do have one digital literacy piece that I would mention because it may be useful for some of you here, that kind of sprung out of some work that we had done with NTIA and others supporting broadband adoption and digital literacy. It's called DigitalLearn.org, and it's an online program, and we particularly developed it for use in libraries and nonprofits where they may not have very many staff, or they may not have very many staff with the skills to teach digital literacy training. So it's an online tool, DigitalLearn.org. It's been around for about a year, and they've had about 57,000 unique visitors in the past year, and they're looking to add some of the higher level skills and non-English languages. So that's the one piece I would say that ALA, other than thinking about these issues in a policy context, that we've done directly around this issue of digital literacy and broadband adoption. But mostly I would talk about libraries. I don't know how many of the folks in this room have partnered with libraries in any of your work. Can I? Because I won't talk so much about libraries. Mostly when we talk to folks in DC, we often find that people have an old version of their experience of libraries, so we have to do a little bit of education. So I'll keep that part of my comments brief, which is basically that libraries are located in every community. There's about 16,400 buildings that gives them a footprint that can be very useful in thinking about education and lifelong learning, and in this case, digital literacy and broadband adoption. I was at the International City County Managers Association last week, and one of the city managers there in Maine had talked about when he did a listening tour and he asked people about libraries and their experiences and the future of libraries. They said, it was the first place that we did all of these things around technology. It was the first place they used a fax machine. It was the first place they used a scanner, a computer, and internet. And I think as we think about broadband adoption, that culture of trust and community connection is an important asset that can be leveraged in this work. There's about 77 million people in a given year that use libraries, both those that are connected and those that do not have connection. Libraries are the #1 point of access for people who lack a home broadband connection. And I think relevant to the conversation about why people don't adopt around issues of relevance, cost, also skills, libraries reach at this intersection of place, skilled people, and also a technology infrastructure that includes actually the internet access and the Wi-Fi, but also the digital content that can be very valuable for people, that if they were to adopt at home, they have a richer experience because much of the library content is increasingly digital. So it's not just using the library resources inside the library building, but it's also using it from home. So we see home broadband adoption as a win. Not only does it make people more successfully engaged in the 21st century, but it also means that they're able to take advantage of library resources at home. The other thing that we know about libraries is that they're a very trusted, non-commercial, non-partisan resource. So a lot of people feel safe starting with us, and we may be part of a ladder of learning that connects with community colleges and other community assets like community media access, those kinds of things. So a couple of examples of what this can look like in a given community. St. Paul here is a good example of the kinds of things that we're seeing in libraries, just to give you a flavor of what it might look like and thinking about how it might support your efforts. St. Paul offers formal classes. They have a lab where people will do the kinds of things you would imagine in a classroom setting. They also have, in addition to kind of basic skills, they have pieces related to specialized job seeking and similar things like that. They have developed a certificate of completion that folks can use with their job applications to show that they've mastered these basic skills. They have open lab sessions for people to drop in and get informal help if they don't want to take a class, for instance. Peer training, so teens talking to teens, seniors talking to seniors. So making sure that there's multiple ways that people can learn. And then also working with native speakers to take classes and training out into the neighborhood, particularly if it's Hmong or Spanish or Somali or Ethiopian in this case, where the library is not bound by its physical footprint. It's also engaged in the community actively in developing these skills where people feel most at home. I think in trends related to how libraries are supporting this and opportunities that may exist for all of you is thinking about how libraries may be partnered in other community-based organizations or like the Parks and Recreation, or even through your Office of Technology Innovation, which was the case in Philadelphia, where they have linked up with the parks and other in the Office of Innovation and Technology to create new opportunities, including at the Heavenly Hall Annex, where they've set up actually mini library spaces within other community spaces. And the last thing I would mention related to an emerging trend that might resonate for folks here is around community media labs, and that idea of digital literacy and the idea of creation as well as consumption. And that in this interactive space, and what is driving some of these adoption will be folks that are using higher capacity, not just to download, but to upload and to share content. And that's increasingly a skill that people are going to need in the workforce. So that's a little bit about libraries. I would say that ultimately, of course, we see digital literacy and broadband adoption as a means to an end, which is to support vibrant, informed, and economically powerful communities. The digital readiness and digital literacy is a fluid state. It's not a fixed state. Anyone who's currently working, like all of us here, knows that need to relearn and learn new applications is really going to be important. And that libraries are in a place to be a good partner and break down silos where we are leveraging library assets along with the resources that all of you can bring to your community. So I hope you will think about libraries in that space, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with my colleagues here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Larra. Now we have Bernadine Joselyn, who is one of our colleagues here in Minnesota. She is the Director of Public Policy and Engagement at the Blandin Foundation, which has been involved with this work for over 10 years in the rural areas of our state.
Hello, everybody. It's so good to see your bright, smiling faces out there, and thanks for coming to Minnesota. We've been really fortunate to host 3 national conversations this month in September around broadband, and as I told Danna, it's not by accident. We're proud of the efforts that we continue to make here and the progress that Danna's office and her work represents. But the story that I have to tell you is about the grassroots, the community Main Street component of that. And it was wonderful to follow librarian. We are all very fond of librarians in Minnesota, as I hope you are in your communities, because they truly are a really key and critical partner to the challenge that we face to bring, to make democracy accessible to all of our residents in the United States. So as Danna said, I work for Blandin Foundation, which is about a 3-hour drive, about 174 miles straight north of here. My little office up in Grand Rapids, a town of about 8,000 people. I look out over the Mississippi River near the headwaters of the Mississippi that then flows right on down here into St. Paul. And the Blandin Foundation is a private foundation. And our mission is to strengthen rural Minnesota communities. So our footprint is we work in the rural parts of our great state of Minnesota. I've taken to saying lately, we're not the Broadband Foundation. We're the Blandin Foundation. And the story about why and how my organization, with a mission as big and ambitious and, as I like to say, squishy, has focused so much time and attention on broadband, I think could be, it's a great red thread theme for this conference here and for all of us that are in this field, because it's not really about broadband, is it? Broadband is the means to an end that we all share, our hope for and aspirations for a vibrant, just, prosperous society. And one of the lessons that I learned, that I keep relearning, and if I could time travel back to the beginning of this work 10 years ago, I wouldn't even use the word broadband because it's confusing and people don't care about broadband. We are about community vitality, and I think that's what all of us, no matter where we are in our work and our lives, care about, is a prosperous, just, and vibrant society, and broadband is the means to the end to get there. So we at the, when I went initially, I was brand new at the Blandin Foundation 10 years ago. What does it mean for a foundation to quote unquote do public policy and engagement? What is this space we're in anyway? A lot of, I went up and did my dog and pony show. We'd done sort of an issues survey. Like I said, we're about vitality and vibrancy. So what are we going to focus on? Are we going to focus on kids or roads or trees or broadband? Really? Is that really the thing that we're going to plant our flag in and make a difference? But because our trustees saw, even that long ago, that internet infrastructure and the ability to use it is absolutely foundational to everything that we care about as a sector, we are going to make this work and help communities organize themselves to get the broadband infrastructure that they need and deserve to make all of the other dreams of the community come true. So it's kind of like, help us help you. I have a friend at the Chamber of Commerce up in Grand Rapids, Bud Stone, and he says that's his motto. He gets up every day and calls people up, you know, and he says, help me, how can I help you get done what it is that you're already getting done, that you already care about? And so one of the lessons I want to leave with you today is to think about you're not adding another to-do list to the top of busy people's agenda. This idea about using information infrastructure to help achieve all the other important goals is a real ticket to getting the most precious resource that your community partners have, which is what? Their time and attention, right? If you ask leaders across our great state and you ask them what is the greatest challenge in your community, I bet you dollars to donuts they're not going to say it's broadband. They're going to say it's jobs, retention, creation, youth engagement, quality and access to health care, efficient government services, and we all know that all that stuff can be done better, cheaper, faster, although my dad said you usually need to pick 2 out of those 3. You can't have all 3. Broadband can help. Internet access can help. So I think it's a great testament to the role of the obligation, almost the ethical obligation that those of us who have the privilege to work in the public sector, who are charged by the people who elect us or hire us to make the world better for the kids behind us, to pay attention to this infrastructure and making sure it's available. Kids out there today think there's a web tone out there. Somebody told me I need to stop telling the story because then I go on to say, you know how there's a dial tone? Guess what? Somebody reminded me. Actually, there aren't dial tones anymore either, so people aren't going to understand your story. But, you know, you pick up the phone, there's a dial tone, and kids these days, right, they think there's a web tone out there. And they don't get that unless we make that so and give people the tools, it's not going to be there. So I'm going to end with a quick overview of some lessons that we've learned of 10 years in the trenches of trying to do this as a community. Because that's the area of impact that we have. Communities know best. You've seen one rural community or one community, you've seen one community. And there's no one-size-fits-all solution to this. Local leadership matters. The communities that have broadband and that don't, if you pick at that story and peel back the onion, there was always a champion there. It takes a local champion. Find that champion, and you're 80% there. As I've already talked a bit about, broadband is not an end in itself. It's a means to achieve every other noble goal that we all share for our communities. High-touch outreach works. And this, you know, this was, when we started, we were a grantee through NTIA, and I'm so glad to see some of our NTIA colleagues in the audience here. And a lot of our assessment was focused on, well, can you really improve adoption? Yes, you can. If you do efforts out there, high-touch outreach does work, but it needs to be hyper-local, personalized, and high-touch. And that's where libraries can be a great partner. Peers make great teachers. Getting business people together, we've had terrific success in Minnesota with something we call social media breakfasts. Peers teaching peers. If the guy down the street's got it, then I can get it too. Cross-community communication is key. Around every circle, you can draw a larger circle, right? Libraries is a deep rabbit hole. It's great. But think about communities as a whole and whole communities so that we get out of this idea of addressing healthcare, education, government. Think holistically about your community. That's been a key here in Minnesota. We get community leaders together and talk about their goals and dreams of the community as a whole, and then how is internet access and adoption going to help us get there. Engage tomorrow's leaders today. Youth are leaders today. They're not only leaders tomorrow. And they can be your greatest partner in building a culture of use. And as Larra said, it's not a check the box, oh, now I'm digitally literate, right? It's like going to elementary school, junior high, high school, college, postgraduate. You got to keep at it. You engage tomorrow's leaders today to get that done. Connect the economic dots. Again, this is about the outcomes you want, not the means to get there. And finally, have patience. This is tenacious. It takes tenacity. I'm looking at Pam's giving me good energy here in the front row. Pam's been doing this work in rural Lac-La-Parle County for over a decade. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before. It takes tenacity, and you need to be able to tell yourself that story over and over again. Look where we came, look where we're going. So goal setting, visioning as a community, and love your local leaders, find a champion, and you can get her done. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadine. As you can tell, we're lucky as a state to have a private foundation with that much engagement. The Blandon Foundation, I think, has sponsored well over 20 communities in developing the capacity around the adoption and use work, and we're very fortunate to have them here in Minnesota. And finally, our last panelist is Dr. Tom Kamber, Executive Director for the Older Adults Technology Services, or OATS, that is doing just fascinating work out of New York, and hopefully he'll tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Darren. I want to also just say that it's really great to be at the NATOA conference, and I go to a lot of conferences, and this is by far the most informative and enjoyable conference that I ever go to. So I just want to thank Tony and Joanne and Lori and Steve and Tanya for doing such an amazing job pulling together people that are great speakers and have a lot to say. So I will try to at least hold up my end of the bargain here. Before, I run a program in New York City, Older Adults Technology Services. We've got the largest, most comprehensive broadband adoption program for older adults operating in the New York City area. Before I talk in more detail about it, I want to show a quick video just to give you a sense of sort of what some of the people look like in our program, what the center looks like, give you a sense of the flavor of what it feels like to be on the ground in a broadband adoption program, and then I'll talk about how we got there. So see if we can cue that.
So that's good. I could take the C, which is easier for me than having to walk to the number one. We are determining which would be the most viable route for me to meet my daughter at a hospital uptown.
Right now we're here at the Senior Planet Exploration Center, which is the country's first technology-themed community center for older adults. People have been streaming through the doors to take programs on computer basics, iPads, digital photography, anything associated with lifelong learning for older adults.
In my work life, I did not have the use of computers. And today, if you do not know how to use the internet, you're really ostracized from so much of society. And this keeps you connected.
Tap the photo, and then go to your email. Well, I think it's important for the simple reason that older adults need to be active so that they don't feel neglected, forgotten about.
I think the iPad is just a marvelous thing. This, particular facility has been invaluable to people like me.
Older adults often are pushed a little bit out of the social and economic mainstream. And technology is the channel for people to find their way back. It's the way that people can get a skill or a tool, or also a piece of knowledge that makes them start reconnecting or rebuilding those networks and those connections, so that now they're saying, yeah, I'm part of society again.
Some people want to connect with family. Some people are curious and will learn some skills like email. It's a process of discovery in terms of why they come here.
It is my way of reconnecting with the outside world. And the more I learn, the more I can use other aspects of it.
Great. So that's obviously the Senior Planet Exploration Center in New York City. I'll just give you a quick sort of thumbnail of how we got to a place where we could launch a center like that. We started in 2004. OATS is really a kind of a community-grown operation. Our first programming was in Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. We worked with low-income housing residents there and started with a single class and a single partner, and then effectively asked the question, what do older adults need to learn to get online, and then built a program around those needs. So seniors typically need more time to get engaged. A lot of older people haven't been online at all. So their first experience is taking a class where they're very anxious and worried about learning new technologies. And so what we did is we reduced a lot of the anxiety that people had by offering our first program as a 20-session class that goes for 10 weeks, and it's free. So it doesn't take any stress for people to feel like they've invested a lot of money and that they're in a big rush to learn everything. And after 10 weeks, what we promise people is all you're going to know how to use is email and the internet and a mouse and a keyboard. So don't be stressed, and we'll learn together, and everybody always learns. Just so you know what you're looking at, by the way, this is the Senior Planet website, which is our content site, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that does and how it's come, but I figured to give you a little chance to see some of the visuals that we present. We started teaching these classes, and we developed a very strong methodology and a way of bringing together trainers and funding to get people online and get them learning, originally obviously in the PC world, but today we do more and more work with the tablets and the iPads and tablet-based systems. About 5 years ago, we did a strategic plan and refocused our energy so that we kind of stopped talking so much about technology and started talking a lot more about older adults. What's going on for senior citizens? What do people need to be healthier, more financially secure, more engaged in their families and communities? And how can we use technology to meet those needs more aggressively and specifically, and stop worrying about how many people are clicking a mouse and how many hours of computer time people are logging, but rather how are people able to access better health information for their Medicare Part D prescription services, or how can we measure people's social engagement and move people from having 2 or 3 family contacts per month up to 7 or 8 family contacts per month, and hold ourselves accountable for that. BTOP happened just after we finished our strategic plan, and Laura, to answer your question, I too would do it again 1,000 times. I hope we can do it 1,000 times. It was a godsend to us because it enabled us to work with the City of New York as our partner that basically they said, what's your strategy? Let's fund that. BTOP really gave us the freedom to do what we knew how to do best and do it at scale. And what we did is we built a citywide infrastructure to support the strategy. So in the 3 years that we had our BTOP resources, we built the Senior Planet Center, which is a retail space in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan. It's right in the center of all the action in New York City. It's got 20-foot ceilings, windows across the front of the area. It feels like a little bit like an Apple store. For people, and it's that nice. It's just gorgeous, and people are always laughing and smiling. When we hold classes, registration at the center, we originally opened them up on a first-come, first-served basis, and we had to stop doing that because when we came in on enrollment day, there was a line down the sidewalk, and people were camped out since 8 o'clock in the morning waiting to sign up for classes. There's just that much desire among senior citizens to learn technology, so we had to change it to more of a lottery and a pre-registration system just to manage the volume of people. We also built 23 community labs around the city with partners in primarily senior centers, but nursing facilities and also housing developments and other partnership relationships. And then we also used resources to build the seniorplanet.org website, which is effectively for seniors. Again, you come from the demographics point of view. When many older adults go online, they don't see themselves. They don't see anything that looks friendly to them. They don't see things that are relevant right away. You can go to maybe the AARP website. There's a few other places, but there isn't a lot of sort of very kind of forward-thinking senior content. And many older adults feel sort of disrespected or excluded from the digital age. And so our thinking with Senior Planet was to highlight some of the kind of more progressive or individualistically supporting people feeling freer as they age and positive visions of older adults. So we brought in a team that had been working with Time Out New York and had them build both a community calendar of events, but also what is effectively now an internationally recognized site where people see kind of really interesting content on a daily basis about older adults and the lifestyle of aging. We call it aging with attitude. That's the tagline that we use for all the Senior Planet activities. That site has had as many as 1 million unique visitors in a given month. We average around 100,000 a month, but sometimes our articles will get a video that'll go viral and we'll get a lot of international attention for those. So we've been able to really get a lot of traction by presenting a different perspective of aging, and that's driving more and more people, both as they're adopting, to continue the utilization issues that have been discussed a lot earlier today. Just 3 real quick lessons that we've learned, and then I'm very excited about the Q&A side of this, so I want to make sure that we don't take too long. One thing that I think is really important that we've learned is really when you're thinking about broadband adoption, the reasons for non-adoption and the reasons that people will utilize are very demographically situated. So for older adults, they have a set of issues that are really quite different from what, say, an immigrant population would have, or what a very, very, very low income or individual that has very limited education might experience. Older individuals have very specific needs online, and so starting with that demographic and organizing the entire program around their needs and their access becomes really, really valuable and important. And things like the peer-to-peer training, what you put in terms of content, how you teach, the methodologies, the ergonomics, everything is oriented around seniors. It really makes a difference. Secondly, we talk a lot about building ecosystems. Oates thinks of ourselves not just as a provider of direct services, but really as a systems builder. So we've been working not just with our program in New York City trying to solve the problem, but now kind of leveraging off of the success we're having in New York. And we've had the first year of the center being open, we had 10,000 visitors just at that one location. We've also had another 20,000 at our satellite sites at the 23 labs that we run around the city. So there's been an enormous volume and activity there. That center's been on the Today Show. It's been in all the major national media. We won the PR Week Award for the best PR campaign of the year. And we've been able then to leverage that success into fundraising and support at the statewide level, where they've just announced a $2 million rural communities initiative, which I'd love to talk more to Bernadine about because she knows a lot more about that than I do. But we're going to be working upstate next year, building similar systems up there. So building these ecosystems that are not just about the labs, but also about the community that gets built up around sustaining and advancing this initiative is really critical. So thinking of all the pieces where it's content, it's hardware, it's connectivity, it's the political and public sector supporters. It's who are your local exchange carriers or your local partners. You know, in New York now we have this kind of Silicon Alley component that we've got, like Etsy and Facebook have opened offices there, and Google is quite close to our headquarters, and so they've been doing work with us. So thinking about how to knit those pieces together is critical. And then the last piece here is institutions matter a lot. I think it's really important not to think in terms of programs, but to think in terms of building longer-term institutions where it's somebody's job to do this. I've been doing this now for 10 years. The gentleman who was on the video, Michael Averoot, who's one of our trainers, has taught 2,000 classes for Oates. He's a licensed clinical social worker. He happens to use his Oates training hours every week as something that he loves doing. He's able to kind of have a better lifestyle because he's one of our trainers. But he's been around working with us for over 5 years now. And so building institutions where you have the talent and you hold on to people, they think of it as a job, you develop relationships that can be longer term and more sustainable, I think are really critical to having the kind of support for adoption programming that can really make an impact and dig in and grow and learn so that we all get smarter and better as we do this over time. I can talk in the Q&A about sort of our next steps and how we're developing a digital learning channel next year. So our next big challenge is going to be, how do you take Oates courses online, and how do we get people to be able to do that who've never been online? So we have a whole strategy that we're developing for that, but it's a moving target, and we constantly have to be getting stronger and smarter in order to do a good job of it. And so for me personally, coming to the NATOA conference is always like a shot in the arm because I learn more from you than you learn from me, so it's a great experience. That's all I got. Thanks.
Yes, that was definitely a shot of vitamin B. Everybody's work is inspirational. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, panelists. And as I promised, we kind of came up with a few questions that we know would tease out some of the detail that might head us down a path. talking about some of the examples that will be useful to this audience. But again, please be thinking about questions yourselves, and we'll pause before we finish for those. And kind of the first one that we have on our list is really for all of the panelists, so whoever wants to jump in on this one. But one of the things we focus on, naturally so, is the positive sides of things, the positive stories that we have out of our work. But can each of you take a minute to reflect on where some of the biggest challenges are? What are the most common barriers to the broadband adoption work that you are doing, and what you're seeing and what you're doing about it, or your agency?
Well, I thought the last panel was actually a good setup for this kind of question, because they were talking about, that availability does not equal adoption, does not equal utilization, and making the point that a lot of times people just don't know what's possible. So that, I think, is probably one of the most common barriers, is that you can't know what's possible until you've actually experienced it. So that's part of what we talk about. We also know, particularly from senior folks that come in, although not only that community, there's a fear factor. So it's relevance, but it's also, will I break it? And there's so much conversation right now about cybersecurity and privacy and fraud that I think that fear has been heightened, and we're hearing that in some of our libraries. And so how do we talk about that, and how do we bring down the fear factor? And then obviously cost is still an issue. So, the things that people do to increase broadband competition and make it more affordable, and other kind of initiatives that support access to the devices and the internet itself. Those are things we know people come to us if they've lost their job and they can't afford a bill anymore. So people drop in and out of adoption. And a lot of times is what we see within the library setting. So the cost is obviously still a factor for folks.
Great. Tom, I'm guessing that you maybe have heard all three of those in your work.
Yes. So do I have to push, does this thing work?
And you may have a different spin on this, but wondering if you might have some...
Yeah, those are all, I think I would second those points. And I think from our perspective, there have been, on the one hand, we have a very diverse user population. So we have older adults coming in who have never touched any of the technology and have been sitting on the digital sidelines. They don't have a smartphone. They've never used a PC or an iPad. And so there's a need for kind of on-ramping people in a really supportive small group environment. So our classes are limited to 12 participants, and we have a lot of participation that we build into the model. But then we've also got people in there that are writing, that have, that are micro-entrepreneurs running Etsy businesses where they're selling crafts. And this is an actual example. They're selling crafts out of a brownstone up in Harlem, and they learned how to do Etsy at the center. And I'm walking by, and they're asking me if I can help them write JavaScript, which I don't even know how to write. So, in fact, I'm going to get the guy from Sandy to come and help us out. But there's really this notion that you need to be able to create a community environment where you've got such diversity of user experience, and also really diverse people. About half the people come in from outside of Manhattan, but the other half live in Manhattan. We've got people that are higher income and people that are lower income all together in the same classes. We found that to be a real asset, but it requires a lot of staff development and volunteer training to get people to manage those individuals within the setting effectively. The other big piece for us is more institutional. This issue of the battle for talent is really, really a big deal. Everybody at the line level and all the supervisors and people involved in this are under enormous pressure to create world-class programming and deliver something that's an absolutely staggering experience for the participants. And we're competing against private sector, businesses all the time that are trying to hire our staff, foundations trying to poach our staff, and things like that. So being able to get people in and motivate them and get enough financial support to pay comparable salaries to everybody throughout the whole system, and fund the partnership relationships where if a partner is coming in and doing a program with us, helping make sure that they're getting included in that funding system has been really a lot of work for me. So I actually don't get to teach classes anymore, and I do seminars. I do the Valentine's Day online dating class every year, and I do a few workshops, but I end up basically doing partnership development and fundraising all the time, and that's a real challenge.
Absolutely. Bernadine?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just add two quick thoughts. One at the real pick and shovel, boots on the ground level, and then a more systemic comment. I think both Tom and Larra did a nice job of talking about the demographic context, and different groups have different barriers. I think about the story when my dad, who grew up in rural Nebraska, tells a story of coming home from school, and he saw a refrigerator being delivered just to his mom's house, just as the ice guy was pulling up with the block of ice. And my dad said, well, we don't need a refrigerator, we have an ice box. But as my grandma pointed out to him, that was because he had no idea what he could do with the refrigerator. So it's finding the refrigerator for every person, finding the maple syrup gatherer on Fond du Lac Reservation who thinks that they have nothing to learn from the internet, and you can show him in a minute that he can get cheaper bottling and cheaper labeling, that, you know, that kind of thing. So finding that, what is the on button for each individual person? Once you can find that on button in this kind of work that we're hearing more about, you've solved the problem. Quickly on the systemic thing, I think a big barrier to us as a society, and something we need to pay attention to, is the conflation between wired and wireless access. And a lot of people think they've got it in their hand, that's good enough. I can get internet here, I can get broadband, and I'm holding up their phone. But they don't understand the barriers to things like job searching, research, and all the higher use, more sophisticated utilization challenges that we can solve with a wired connection that we just can't with wireless. So paying attention, and we're doing this here in Minnesota, does it count? Is wireless good enough? Does that give us the infrastructure that we need and the ability to use those more advanced applications to meet our goals as a society? It's something for us to pay attention to.
Great, thank you. And kind of moving back towards the positive lens of the story, if someone came up to you today and asked you what some of the most promising practices are out there that you're seeing in helping communities create demand for better broadband and maximizing its benefits, what ideas might you recommend they focus on? And this is open for what ideas are you seeing out there that are most exciting and show the most promise right now that maybe we haven't already heard about today?
Well, I think some of it, I mean, clearly building connections between people's utilization of broadband and growing systems where there's a real challenge where there's really a need for it is obviously the sweet spot here, right? So to me, I think the managed care environment is a really fruitful place to direct energies, because hospitals and medical systems and providers and insurance companies are now really under the gun in terms of both the cost issues and the quality issues of healthcare provision. So as people are rating their hospitals and their providers, that's beginning to affect the bottom line now for the managed care systems. And a lot of those experiences are mediated by technology. So thinking about how to plug in broadband adoption services for people passing through a system like that. For seniors, it's sort of obvious, but think about for younger people as well, where younger people are, you can focus on young people with pediatric illnesses of certain kinds that are at certain ages, and think about how to promote adoption, or families that might not be part of that might not show up at your center or your library, but you can get to them in a place like that. I think there's a real need. The schools obviously are a real important challenge, opportunity there as well, and there's a lot of really interesting innovation going on at schools all over the country that I'm constantly hearing about. And then there was another. I'll stop there. But I think these institutional dynamics of getting the sort of best practices going are making a big difference. So
that managed care one is interesting because we talk about often I'm at, we're getting down to that adoption. Well, my mom doesn't use a computer and never is going to or never will. But the answer is she may never use a computer, but her doctor is going to want her to have a connection.
I had one other
in order
important one.
To kind of that beginning of that managed care spectrum while she's still trying to stay in her home.
Yeah, it's funny. I just got an email from a U.S. congressman that I met randomly on the train recently, and he's asking if I can help him think about how to set his mom up on an iPad because she's engaged in a lot of healthcare challenges, and he's trying to think about the right way to support her. The other thing that I think is really helpful as best practices is I find intergenerational programming to be very powerful. We've been doing it forever. We've always had different sort of small models for it. But it always generates a lot of excitement in communities. It always brings together people who are sort of motivated by that intergenerational connection. And I think that for us anyways, we've seen a lot of best practices emerging around intergenerational work as well.
I bet you Bernadine might have something to add.
Well, I think another piece, and maybe this is a theme that also cuts across here, is this idea of partnerships and breaking down silos. I mean, that I think that we don't live in separate little boxes, and I think we're stronger together. And one thing that's growing in libraries that I think also goes to the relevancy piece is around kind of entrepreneurship and small business development. That, you know, we have seen a lot of partnerships in libraries with small business administration or departments of labor, and thinking about, you know, it's again not about the broadband, it's about what it enables, which is, you know, job skills and that kind of economic vitality. And as we're looking at kind of where jobs are going, that, you know, it looks like there's going to be like 40% of folks are going to be temporary, mobile, or contract. So they're going to be working for themselves in more and more cases. So we've been seeing a lot of interest around kind of helping people move beyond what we were hearing in the last panel about, you know, getting a website, really basic kind of stuff, to fully taking advantage of and utilizing the variety of applications that are available. So again, it's part of that spectrum of opportunity. There's going to be more than one. You know, you're not going to stop. You're going to continue to grow and change. So I think the partnership piece is an area where I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Here, and then I would also chime in about recognizing the primacy of relationships. At the foundation, we like to say that change follows relationship lines. And at the end of the day, people do stuff because of the people involved and the relationships involved, and especially because this is very long-term work, paying attention to the relationships at play can have a huge impact on the tenacity of the endeavor. One very short then best practice here in Minnesota, we're starting a conversation about embedding technology planning in comprehensive plans. Those of you out there who have cities or municipalities as targets of impact or action in which you're trying to work, we see a lot of promise in including explicitly the requirement that communities think proactively about technology planning and the adoption component of that, and talk about baking it in. That is an automatic review, update cycle, and then you can easily ask the questions about, and are we leveraging the opportunities that this technology offers to our communities?
Can I take a moment? Who in the audience is involved in that type of discussion with their municipality or their county or their state, the idea of building the broadband issue into comprehensive and the planning? That's something at the state office we are surveying, and I'm just wondering how prevalent that activity is, because it seems like we could certainly motivate some change by engaging that planning community in a way that we haven't done maybe in a real robust way to this point. Yeah, very nice. The next question we have is actually, again, for you, Bernadine, and that has to talk a little bit, although I think you gave us a good snapshot, but maybe even touch on some of the additional points of the role of philanthropy and not-for-profits in helping communities get better broadband and the skills to use it.
So in pretty much every community across America, there's some sort of civic infrastructure whose job it is or can be to convene and draw attention. And I think that the philanthropic sector is uniquely positioned to do that, but so are other trade associations or economic development professionals as well. And I think that when I first, I'll tell you, the light bulb first went on, I don't mean this in a partisan way at all, for me, but on the night of President Obama's inauguration, his first term, when he stood up there in that park in Chicago and talked about the role of the government as convener. And that is a really key function, and a lot of what the sparks that happen in communities, again, everything starts with a conversation. And getting diverse perspectives in the room and having people just even setting up a conversation about what do we dream about. Leadership is about organizing hope. And so even if you don't have a Blind Foundation in your county or in your state, there are a lot of organizations who are out there to try to make their communities better, and thinking of that power of convening and setting the table for a conversation is a really important role that after you spark that, people are hungry for that kind of conversation, and they can become self-organizing around it, but somebody's got to set the table. So I think it's, money follows vision. People outside philanthropy don't like to hear that, but it's true. It really isn't about the money at all. It's about tenacity and vision and stick-to-itiveness, and anybody in the community can call that conversation.
And I would just support that comment from Bernadine. Again, in Minnesota, we've got stakeholders from all different aspects. We've got our legislators, we've got the governor's office, we have a broadband task force, we have our county elected officials, we have our township elected officials, and we have the private foundation community, and they act as a backboard for our policy work and the work that we're doing that comes at it from slightly different angle, and so we get better coverage by having that robust and holistic coverage on the issue. I think I've got one more for Larra, and that's specifically, you've touched a few times and really reminded us on what a good position libraries are in to act as community partners. And I think you came with some examples, but just kind of want to give you an opportunity if you had other good examples of how we might look at libraries and who might be good partners that we might not have thought of before.
Well, I think, how Tom phrased it as an ecosystem, I think is also kind of how I look at it. And I think the BTOP work really encouraged this. So it was really helpful for us where we saw new partnerships emerge with some, what may be more traditional now, like workforce and education, but also around, healthcare I think is an exploding area for where there's a need. And the more people that you bring into the pot, I think the stronger it is, particularly when you have a vision for what that looks like. One example from the St. Paul area, for instance, where they built a community process around assessing and quantifying digital literacy knowledge, which I think there's a lot of questions like, how do you know if it's successful? And so they came together, and this was with the St. Paul Public Library and the St. Paul Community Literacy Consortium, and they built this together, and then they also vetted it with the Department of Education and the workforce centers and adult basic education professionals to make sure that it spoke to what were the workforce needs for this basic certificate of computer skills, and then also was inclusive of these different groups and their needs. So I think that kind of thing, and also the role that libraries can play as far as convening these kind of community conversations and bringing people together. So I think the strongest things that we have, the strongest projects I have seen involve that kind of partnership, and it cuts across rural, urban, suburban. So
great, thank you. Before I go any further, kind of open it up for questions. Has anything that you've heard up here? And I know we're the after the lunch stupor.
Ooh, obstacles to which?
Well, back to the partnerships. Mm-hmm.
Often I find that's the case, that when I'm out talking with people, they'll go, oh, of course. When I say library and explain some of the assets that we have that could be leveraged, it makes sense to people, but it's not how they remember libraries. They remember libraries in a very specific context. So it's partly just turning the lens a little bit. So that's, I think, the number one barrier that I find. It's certainly not the other one. You find cultural differences between different organizations, and librarians like to organize things. So sometimes we have to get past some kind of professional, cultural issues. But I think there's a huge willingness, and then there's this opportunity around the learning labs, and where we're seeing that. And I know there's some folks here that have done some work in that area, where I think this idea of the interactive nature, and where we have a common vision with public access and community television about the idea of people, of that democratizing force, and creating helping people tell their own stories and how the digital media can help do that. And so we've seen a significant growth in that. So if there was a barrier, I think it's coming down, and I think there's more opportunities for collaboration there. And when we think about the youth, this has been hugely important for engaging youth, and so that they're not just consumers, they're empowered to tell their own story. And then the library, similar to Senior Planet, where we're capturing those stories and holding on to them and creating kind of a digital archive where the library also becomes a place to hold those stories that are more broadly inclusive than what we might see from kind of more commercial products or something that's a little bit more grassroots and speaks to the community.
So Larra kind of speaks from the national model. Does anybody, I mean, we got a lot of experts in the room. Does anyone have any good examples of library partnerships in this area from the work that they do? Mike?
St. Paul is a great place to look at this. They were beneficiary of the IMLS U-Media grant process around just in June. They just opened up a learning lab with the Payne Arlington Library and Rec Center. That was sort of the first opportunity for St. Paul to be thinking about combining recreational activities with libraries rather than having things separate. Really think about sort of the continuum of experience that can occur in a community, and think about sort of the investment you have in a whole community rather than just having the T-ball experts over here and the knowledge people over here, right? So that's a very interesting space, and I actually suggest that people have the opportunity to go up to the Avenue and take a look at it. It's open on a regular basis for their learning lab, and it would be a great opportunity to see something in concrete, really, literally.
Absolutely wonderful. I don't know.
Oh, right. Yeah, right.
So we just participated in the webinar where the libraries in Chattanooga and Kansas City
Oh, sure.
talked about what they were doing with the gigabit, the creation of the makerspace, and all of the cool things they're doing. But we've actually been involved with the libraries for a long time, and they're an incredibly important partner. They're the most impactful digital inclusion organization in our region. But we want to now take it further. I guess I also just wanted to say thank you to Tom for saying, well, we have a strategic plan and then the timing is good for this money flowing. And then Bernadine saying, money follows vision. I think what you're really saying is that we need to develop those, whether they're called local broadband strategic plans, which there are at least 9 communities in Oregon have done. But I think it's really important for all of us in this room to take those points. And then the other point, which I'm very grateful for, is patience and tenacity, because we've only been at it for 15 years.
That's totally true.
You are so right. Any other questions? Anybody hear anything up here that they want to hear a little bit more detail?
So, Bernadine, I had a question for you. You said that your foundation has been doing this for 10 years, So, have you, and I think,
Larra. Yeah. I answered all of it.
we touched on the evaluation piece, but have you, as a funder, looked at what your impact's been, and, I mean, as far as in rural communities, similar demographics, have we seen a increase in digital literacy of your community versus other communities that don't necessarily have heard? How are you looking at that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Not everything worth counting counts, and not everything you can count is worth counting. The big surprise to us in our work is that when we go back and ask our community partners what has been the biggest impact on their community, what they say to us is relationships. We're working together in new ways. We see value in one another's work. We see how we're able to connect the dots, and we have now the capacity to be self-organized and be ready to jump on opportunities that come over the transom. We know who to call, and we're aligned. In Minnesota, I like to say that we are program rich and systems poor. We got a lot of little programs out there, and where the leverage and the bang comes is when you can get people aligned and they can see how they fit in this ecosystem of services that we're creating. That said, we have spent a lot of attention on trying to measure stuff and count stuff. It's just the stuff that and I understand that as a taxpayer and as a former federal employee myself, that was, especially when you're spending federal dollars, you need to be able to tell make sure there's no fraud and misuse and stuff and tell the story. And under ARA, they're counting job creation and subscriptions, which isn't necessarily the most important thing to be counting. If you'd like more information about what we did count and how we do, I'm going to leave some materials here that go into great depth about the indicators that we established, including subscription rates, which did increase as a result of our BTOP funding faster than they did in areas that weren't. But we find counting numbers of hours spent on computers or butts in seats doesn't really get at what it is that we're trying to create, which is culture change and people feeling efficacious and like it can make a difference if they work to make their community better.
And again, I would add supportive comments that actually goes to the comments from the woman in Portland as well is, well, it's squishy, it's not measuring that we can put on a graph, but speaking now as a potential funder of broadband-based projects, we can see the difference between those communities who've been engaged in these dialogues, have developed the vocabulary, and have formulated their vision. They are much more well prepared for the opportunity that's coming down the path. So at some point, that actually can be measured to some extent. So
can I add one point to that? It feels to me like we're kind of hitting a second stage of the metrics discussion, where originally it was kind of about how many seats and butts and chairs that we're measuring, and a couple of years ago we developed a relationship with the AARP Foundation, and they asked us what we could do around social isolation, and we put together a project with them that wrapped up last year. But as part of that, they asked us to help them design a metric management system for measuring before and after changes in social isolation for people that went through this 6-month initiative that we had. And we worked with a team from Cornell, and they had already developed a lot of metrics around social isolation, but none of it had ever been adapted to a community intervention model. There was lots and lots of research. They've been publishing articles for years about who's isolated, who's not, what sort of patterns exist, but nobody had said, if you go and sit with people and give them, I think our program had 46 sessions over 6 months, 46 sessions worth of intervention, and can you baseline them and then look at the end and then 6 months later, and there weren't any metrics for that. So we actually built a 59-question questionnaire that identified sort of 4 dimensions of social isolation that we thought related to technology. So it was actually tailored to broadband adoption questions, and Cornell went and found validated surveys in the sociological literature that had these questions that had been used in the past, but we adapted everything to focus on the environment that we're doing the programs. And those metrics have now come back. We have the numbers, and the statistics are fabulous. We've been finding all sorts of movement on people's social engagement. We found a 25-point change on our kind of key social engagement indicator, and then we use that system. We asked Verizon Foundation if they would support us doing that in 2 more areas. They just announced it like last week that we're building 2 more metric models, one around civic engagement and one around lifelong learning to measure people's progress. So there's a lot of great work to be done there. I think we're having to build it now, though. I mean, I think we're kind of at the point where we have to dig in and do it, and it's not cheap. I mean, we're talking about projects that cost tens of thousands of dollars just to build one of these models effectively. No, but I can get it to you by email if you'd like to see it.
Well, I was going to ask Tom, are they specifically geared to, I mean, I can imagine social inclusion would be specifically geared to seniors, but are the other ones, are you specifically looking at just the senior population for your work, or did the metrics, do you think, cut across other populations?
We did it specifically for seniors, but what was interesting was that AARP asked, we actually were kind of wagging the dog on this one, and Walter Woods, who's no longer at the foundation, but he recognized that it would be very applicable to the rest of their work, so they asked Cornell to adapt the survey for all populations and just make some minor changes to it. That's become their metric for all their social and isolation work there, and they think it would also be useful outside of the seniors. So there's I don't see any major reasons why it wouldn't be from the survey that we've developed so far.
And if I could just leap in, I would be negligent to not mention that at the level of impact of community, at the Blanton Foundation, we've used and partnered with an outfit out of New York City called Intelligent Community Forum, ICF. You can Google them, and they have a intelligent community metrics that looks, again, holistically at 5 elements of being I guess an intelligent community as opposed to a stupid community, right? But they've adapted. There are data points and indicators that we've adapted to rural settings around workforce, innovation, digital literacy, access, infrastructure, and I forget the other.
Marketing
and marketing and thank you, marketing and engagement. Danna was drilled in these as a community partner, and it's really very, very interesting. And again, it's sort of an action research concept where the big benefit to the community comes not in someone from the outside swooping in and giving them a report card, but them themselves identifying where their strengths and aspirations are, and then holding themselves accountable. So there really is an opportunity at the community level to engage the community in holding itself accountable over time. And again, the overtime thing is important.
I have to add one more thing I said really, really fast. It's also amazing how much the metrics drive the activity on the ground. So once we built this 59-question questionnaire, we knew what the target was that we were shooting for, and when we went and did the capacity training with our partner in Washington, D.C., this group Family Matters, we were doing these 3-day trainings for their staff and their team, and we said, this is what you have to get to happen. These are the questions we want to see before and after change in. And they all read the questions and said, oh, okay, I get it. So if they've had 2 people in their network this week, we want them to have 6 people in the network. And how do we do that? And so it gave people clarity about what they were doing as activists and as program staff and as directors. And I think this kind of a relationship between the sort of collaborative metric development and then bringing it back down to the ground and saying, now we know what we're all trying to do, makes the programs more effective. And I think a lot of the work that NTIA was doing about trying to get people to think more seriously about this with Gwen and those guys is really, I think, to this point, it really there's a real opportunity here.
So Tom, you're actually making the argument what gets measured gets done, and maybe we should be spending more attention on actually measuring.
I like it. I mean, it's the accountability side. I don't mean to take away from, I also agree with your point that not everything that matters counts, and and there's some things that it shouldn't be. We should not obsess over metrics so much that we don't also understand that relationships and mission and building sort of long-term sustainable systems matters. But the metrics can really be a critical piece of it, and I think it's just starting to get healthy now.
Well, and it goes to that vision piece as well, as the outcomes-based evaluation. If you don't know where you're trying to get to, then how will you know that where you are on that continuum?
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions from the audience?
Tom, considering your 23 satellite sites, is there information on your senior plan website about who you partnered with and how you got it done, or is that a background document?
We had an interesting challenge. Years and years and years ago, we decided to split the oats.org and the oats corporate information away from the Senior Planet information. The thinking was as seniors went online, I didn't want them coming to learn about me because the point wasn't to get seniors to know about my nonprofit, it was to get them to build community with each other. So we broke off a separate sort of brand called Senior Planet, which is a project of Oats. And so when you're an older adult, you go through an Oats program, you focus on Senior Planet. So for people out there, you can log on to Facebook, friend us on Facebook, and go to Senior Planet. Anybody can use the calendar. And then if you want to learn about Oats, you would go to oats.org, which has the information about the partnerships and what we've done. That site is literally being relaunched next week, so you can peek at it today, but if you give it a week or two, it'll look a lot better and be a lot more up to date. And also just, I'm at tkamber@oats.org, so just email me, and I can send you stuff as well if you want to know. We have way more information than we could put on the site.
We have time for one more question, and if you don't have one, I do. And that's just very briefly, because I'm not seeing any other hands, just very briefly, what does success look like from your vantage point at this point? A quick few words on what does success look like in the work that you're doing?
Gosh, I think the two pieces of it are the people. It's all people oriented. So part of it is one of the great things about working with a digital space is the seniors send us emails. And I got an email from a woman the other day who said, I'm sorry I haven't been at the center all that much. I knew her when she came to the center. She was being evicted from her apartment. She had an eviction notice on the fridge. And she took our workforce class because she was trying to find a job. She was in her late 60s. And she said that she kept going to these job interviews, and people would basically ask her actionable questions. Like, first of all, just write down how old are you? But then they would be like, well, what year did you graduate from college? You're trying to kind of position her. And when she came through our program, she found out about Elance, which is an online freelancing business organization that's got tens of thousands of participants. And she started doing writing through Elance because you can be anonymous and nobody knows how old you are. They have that New Yorker cartoon on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog, right? Yeah. And she has now moved into a new place in New Jersey, paid off her bills. She's in the top 100 Elance writers in the world, and there's like tens of thousands of them. And so she sent this email to us saying, I'm in a much more secure place now, you've totally changed our lives. And so you get these individual stories from people. And then the other piece is just the staff. Like, I work with the team at Oats, and people feel like it's an elite team, like they're dying to get in. People want to get there because it's the cool place to be working where all the action is, and that's what it feels like. It feels like it feels a little bit like what it must have felt like to be in, Apple in 1978 or something like that, this notion that we're kind of at the formative stage of something really awesome. And that's just really about working with a team and watching them, email each other back and forth at 11 o'clock at night on a Sunday about something that came up in the meeting. Yeah, it's just, but they're enjoying it. Like, they're not being like, oh, you have this question for me. It's that they'll come, there's just the energy that comes out of it, which I really love.
Very cool. I feel really strongly that success is a vibrant democracy. I really think that unless and until all Americans have equal access to the internet and ability to use it, we will be underfulfilling our promise as a nation and a people. So to me, success is equal opportunity for all.
Yeah. It doesn't get any better than that. I think we should stop right there, because that would speak nicely to me as well. So thank you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, panelists. Thank you for your questions.